Good evening, everyone. My name is Shekhar Krishnan. I'm running for City Council here in Jackson Heights, Elmhurst, Queens. It's so great to see so many of you all on for tonight's exciting discussion on open space and creating open space and making safer streets in our neighborhoods and also throughout New York City as well. Today is Earth Day. And we also put out for Earth Day too a summary of a 5-point summary of our plan for open space and safe streets in our neighborhood. There's so many things that we need to do urgently to make our city far more sustainable and our Earth far more protected in the years ahead too. One of those things as a start really is to think about how we center people and pedestrians and open space, open public space over cars, both in our city, in our neighborhoods too. There's a long history of this kind of activism here in Jackson Heights and Elmhurst that we'll be talking about tonight too. But it is really a way to rethink who the streets of the city are for, how we design our city to make it as pedestrian friendly and as accessible and as safe as possible. And in doing so, create far more open green space, both here in Jackson Heights and Elmhurst and around New York City. Now, one thing we have to make clear up front is open space and safe streets are critical for us in our neighborhoods. But Jackson Heights and Elmhurst actually rank towards the bottom of all New York City neighborhoods when it comes to open green space. And what we need to do is really re-envision, reimagine the way, as I said before, how we think about streets and urban planning in our neighborhoods. And really think about it, as I always say, where you live connects to everything else around you. Your access to schools, to public health and public hospitals, and also to the open space that you have and the quality and safety of our streets. It varies neighborhood by neighborhood in New York City. And these are the topics that we're going to get into tonight as well. So I'm so excited to welcome you all for this discussion. It goes without saying, of course, as we open up the topic, that we've got a 34th Avenue in our neighborhood that is a model open street. In fact, should be a model open street for the New York City Open Streets program across New York City because of how important it's been for our neighborhood during this pandemic. A neighborhood where we were the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic, but there were so many in our communities, especially immigrant families, who couldn't socially isolate, living in overcrowded housing where COVID was rampant. 34th Avenue was such a blessing and a lifeline for our community. 30 blocks where all of us use it every day. My older son learned to ride his bike on 34th Avenue at the height of the pandemic. Our younger son, our 2-year-old, learned to ride a scooter. And there's so many uses that we see, from seniors to families to our kids playing on a 34th Avenue open street. This is the future of New York City that we need to be talking about and thinking about. And that's why on Earth Day today, we thought it was so important to have this conversation with two incredible advocates and activists, both in our neighborhoods and around New York City, doing this work every day. I'm so thrilled to introduce Rhoda Dunn, who is an awesome, very beloved activist in our neighborhood, who has done great work around 34th Avenue, from putting back and removing the barricades every day, who's an avid biker in our neighborhoods too, and can talk, as we will later tonight, about bike lanes in our neighborhood as well. And we also have tonight too with us, urban planning expert, open space expert, and longtime community activist in our neighborhood, Donovan Finn, one of the founders of the Jackson Heights Green Alliance, someone who just wrote an excellent article on 34th Avenue in Streets blog, and as an urban planner has thought deeply and written extensively about streets and public space, both in our neighborhoods of Jackson Heights and Elmhurst and across New York City. So I'm so glad to have both of them here tonight. And what we'll do is we'll have a bit of question and answer to begin with, and then we'll open it up to all of you for questions. So if there are questions you want to put in the chat, please start doing so when you can, and we'll make sure to get to them too. But let's start out, with a question. I'll jump around between both of you. Donovan, maybe you can situate us a bit in the history here. As I said before, Jackson Heights and Elmhurst rank some of the lowest when it comes to, or the neighborhoods with the least amount of open space in New York City. When we talk about that, we also have to think about the history of Traverse Park and what happened when it came to the expansion of Traverse Park. A play street before before it looked like it does now, was an active street for cars that we closed off. And, as someone who really led this work, you saw what that work was like. And I'd love for you to talk a bit about the history of open space in our neighborhood, and also let's situate this conversation around what was so important about that expansion of Traverse Park, and what perspective shift happened in the last decade of work that was done there.
Hi, thanks for that question, Shaker. Thanks for having me here tonight. Thanks to everybody for spending what is now turning out to be a somewhat chilly evening, but here with us. So yeah, I think that I see a lot of parallels, and I think you used the word led or something. Let me be clear. Turning 78th Street, taking it from being a street that had cars and parking, 24/7, to eventually becoming basically an integrated piece of Traverse Park. Those of you who have lived in the neighborhood for less than 5 years might not know that that was a street not that long ago. And now it just looks like a seamless part of that park. And that was a lot of work. And I definitely spilled some blood and some sweat and some tears, sometimes all on the same day with that project. But, there were a lot of other people that were involved in that, actively on the ground, in City Hall, with their wallets, showing up to community events and signing petitions and going to rallies. And, so it takes a village, right? And I think that that's something important to remember for 34th Avenue as well. But I think that the thing that is most salient about 78th Street and what it used to be, and 78th Street and what it is now, is to remember that it was just an idea at one point, right? And it was an idea that a lot of people didn't like. A lot of elected officials and city government bureaucrats told us was crazy. And we made it happen anyway. And I could spend probably 8 hours telling that story, so I won't do that. But, I think that one of the things we showed is that positive change is possible if you have a vision and you have a community that's supportive of that vision, and you can, put all the pieces in place. And there are a lot of moving parts that have to fall into place to make that kind of substantive change happen. We're not really making new park space in New York City, but we did it at Traverse Park. And we did it with Staunton Field as well, where the tennis courts are. That used to be private property owned by the Garden School, and that's now city property as well. Thanks in no small part to the advocacy of people in this neighborhood. So, positive change can happen, but you have to have a vision. And I think, we're at that stage now where 34th Avenue, there's the beginning, there's an idea and the beginnings of a vision, and there's a lot of interest. And now we have to funnel it and channel it in the right way and make sure that, we don't take our eyes off the prize, and we go from here to where we decide we want to end up. We have to get there. And we also have to be patient and, and know that it will take a while, but I think we can do it.
Well, thanks so much, Donovan, and for that history and that perspective. And, I'd also add to that too. That was a similar battle that we engaged in Diversity Plaza too, right? Which was created out of a transportation traffic safety study, and was a street before that a bus would go down, that had an intersection with one of the highest rates of traffic accidents in our city, and also in our community, of course. And where that started and how controversial that was too, and the work that so many of us did as part of Friends of Diversity Plaza, and to now see through visioning sessions, just like at Traverse Park, to how Diversity Plaza has ended up as this great town square and organizing space in our neighborhood, kind of parallels also the Traverse Park story as well, in terms of what imagining and reimagining can look like and actually achieve in our neighborhood. So thank you for that perspective, Donovan. Rhoda, I want to turn it over to you as someone who's on 34th Avenue every day, as a biker in our neighborhood too. Can you talk a bit about two things? One, how 34th Avenue has been for you in our neighborhood, and two, a bit about your experience as a biker here in our neighborhood and really in Western Queens.
I got engaged with 34th Avenue during the dark days of the COVID pandemic, when it all sort of started, when the pandemic started. And, for me, it was such a great outlet, a place to go, a place to connect, when it didn't feel like there was any a safe place to go to. So that's kind of what what it meant for me. It was a place where I got to see my friends. I met a lot of new people. And it's also where I got involved with biking. I had owned a bike since 2017, and I just never rode up that bike because I was just too afraid to ride my bike in New York City. I mean, it's just a very overwhelming thing to ride a bike in New York City. And I started riding on 34th Avenue on my own. And then a couple of my other girlfriends in the neighborhood saw me riding my bike, and they're like, oh, I really want to ride a bike, but I'm afraid, and I'm like, hey, why don't you ride with me? We can all ride together. And it kind of grew into this thing where that's kind of how we spent our last summer in de-COVID, is on our bikes exploring New York City. But it all started with 34th Avenue. 34th Avenue was our safe place. It's where we, got our sort of confidence about, bike riding. And apparently it was in the New York Times where it said that during the COVID pandemic, ridership among women increased, significantly. And it was basically because all of a sudden the streets had become calmed. And so for me, this whole 34th Avenue, it represents what is possible. And I'm really excited. A lot of us have been talking about, we need to be thinking, dreaming big about what the possibilities are. And what, to me, this represents the beginning of how we can expand bike ridership to a wider group of people and expand it out. And like for me, I would really like to see the bike lane that sort of originates on 34th Avenue really be connected to the 39th Avenue open street all the way, like a safe way to get there. And then all the way to Grand Central Parkway. Because imagine if we could connect 34th Avenue all the way to, to 114th? Is it 114th?
Yep.
That would give us like a car-free way to get to Flushing Meadows Park, which is really our big park in the neighborhood. And imagine you could take your kids on their bikes, they could rollerblade, we could all walk and not worry about, being hit by a car. And I mean, that's what it means to me. I really feel that I think we should be able to ride our bikes safely without fear of losing our lives. And it really, to me, is a question of safety and about valuing the lives of people who want to get around town in another way besides driving in a car. The other thing is I just got a scooter, a little motorized scooter too. And that's a very scary thing to be riding around as well, but they're kind of great. And I just think the whole idea of anything but a car is exciting. I'm gonna get my rollerblades out. And the first place I'm gonna be rollerblading is on 34th Avenue. And all of this is happening because of 34th Avenue. It gives you a place to sort of, regain these skills and get some confidence so you can go beyond that. So I think 34th Avenue has just been great. And I have so many stories of, there's one guy who helped put the barricades out every morning, and he had lost his wife, recently, and he was just staying at home all the time. And then by just putting out the barricades every morning, he met so many of his neighbors, and he, became less depressed, and he became so connected to the community. And I just thought there's just so many stories like that of people who have lived in this neighborhood for 7 years and didn't really know a lot of people. And just by walking on the streets, sitting in that median, having a sandwich and talking to people as they walk by, I just think it's such a great anchor for a neighborhood. I think it's great. I'm obsessed with 34th Avenue.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, Rhoda. And I think even in addition to 34th Avenue, what you mentioned about having the importance of protected bike lanes, both here in Western Queens, there's so many bike lane dead ends in Western Queens too, that imagine a way to have them all connected in a safe way to get from park to park, even to Flushing Meadows Corner Park. As someone who bikes myself too, having my kid, one of the kids in the back seat of our bike, you're absolutely right. When you go down 34th Avenue and go to Flushing Meadows, there's no real safe way to go because you don't have protected bike lanes that go all the way there. So I think that's a great point and really an important piece of street safety in our neighborhood, in our city too. I wanted to go on that note about Flushing Meadows and also 34th Avenue. Donovan, I wanted to turn it back over to you to talk a bit about what needs to change about the way that we think about streets and space in our city. I know it's a broad topic, but I just feel like New York City is so far behind so many other cities in the world in the way that we think about streets and space. And maybe we can talk about it, or you can talk about it from the perspective of equity. And when it comes to park space and open space, there is clearly systemic inequality among which neighborhoods have it, which neighborhoods like ours that don't. So if you want to use our own neighborhood as an example and talk about the larger perspective on what needs to change about streets and open space in our city, that would be great. And I know you had a couple pictures as well, or slides that at any point you want to show them too, that would be great. But just wanted to give you some time to talk about that too.
Sure. Well, yeah, again, this is something I could talk about forever. And since I am a college professor, I tend to drone on. So
No.
Start waving your hands around once I hit like the 30-minute mark. Well, let's start with Jackson Heights first, right? This is a neighborhood that 15 years ago, New Yorkers for Parks, which is an advocacy group here in New York City, did a study. And Danny Drum's council district, it wasn't Danny Drum's at the time, it was previous council member, but ranked last in the city in terms of percentage of land area dedicated to parks and open space in the whole city. Actually, it didn't rank dead last. It ranked second to last. The one that ranked dead last was a neighborhood on the Upper East Side, as I recall, that borders Central Park. So within that council district, technically, there was a slightly smaller percentage of open space than there is in Jackson Heights. But then those people just had to cross the street and they were in Central Park. So I have this, let me just actually, I'm trying to resist sharing my screen, but let me just do it for a second here, Shaker. This is one of my favorites that Todd Goldman dug up for a few years ago. This is from the New York Times from 1971. This is Patrick Burke, the president-elect of the Jackson Heights Homeowners Association in 1971, describing Jackson Heights as a lousy place for children. No play streets, no ball fields, no bike streets. So this is not an issue that is new to Jackson Heights. And we did a little analysis when we were working on 78th Street, and we came up with this graphic that someone from our group put together. And sorry, let me just, and so in New York City, the average is that for every acre of park space, and granted, this counts our big parks in New York City, but on average, as a New Yorker, there's 280 of us for every acre of park space we have in this city. But in Jackson Heights, there are 14,000 people for each acre. So, and that acre is pretty much Traverse Park and, a couple of other little smaller areas. So there's a real equity issue in terms of the access we have here in Jackson Heights. And this is a historical, relic of how Jackson Heights was developed as a commuter suburb, and the housing crunch after World War II, and there's all these factors that went into it. But the fact of the matter is, there used to be more open space. Well, this neighborhood used to be nothing but open space, right, at one point, and we didn't plan carefully enough for it. And so one of the things that frustrates me from time to time is when people are, say, oh, we can't turn 34th Avenue over to to pedestrians, we need it for cars. Well, my first argument would be that that street represents about 1% of the street space in Jackson Heights, for one thing. For another thing, what we're trying to do actually is to fix a mistake that was made, or a series of mistakes that were made 100 years ago, right? So just because we made a mistake in the past doesn't mean we shouldn't try to fix it now. That would be my argument, right? But additionally, Shaker, I think you're right. And, I think Rhoda hit on this a little bit too, talking about biking and scooters. And, the world is changing. And this whole question of sort of micro mobility and, using alternative modes of transportation. And also just, I think, especially post-COVID, but even before that, just a real acknowledgement in cities about what public space is for, and that it's for exercising, and it's for kids to play, and it's for transportation, and it's for staying healthy, and it's for just enjoying, just getting out of these four walls and seeing something else for a while. And I just think that cities are, and you can look at examples all over the world, Paris and Bogota, Colombia, and you name it. They're not all in Scandinavia, by the way. And you can see cities around the country and around the world rethinking what the function is of this public resource, right? Streets are a public resource. They're owned by all of us in common with our tax dollars. And in many places we've decided, you know what, car owners, they're getting way more than their fair share out of these pieces of our communally owned infrastructure. So maybe we need to start rethinking, even just around the margins, just here and there, how we can rethink small, tiny, infinitesimal proportions almost in terms of the amount of streets, but those can have major impacts, especially as Rhoda said, if they're connected together and they're part of a holistic system. It can be a real game changer for all kinds of people. And I could speak about the social equity issues forever as well, and I don't want to go on forever, but one of my favorite quotes was, I think it was Ed Wesley from the Jackson Heights Beautification Group when we were working on closing 78th Street. And he used to say, the reason he thought of this as a social equity issue to expand the amount of open space in Jackson Heights is because for many folks who use Traverse Park and who live in Jackson Heights, who live in East Elmhurst, that park is their summer vacation, right? They don't have a country house. They don't get on a plane and go, somewhere across the world for vacation. They don't rent an Airbnb. That's it right there. That park, that's their summer vacation. And I think, we could talk about a lot of the other issues around health and all kinds of other things that are social justice and social equity related to open space. But I think that's a pretty powerful way to think about why it's so important to expand access to open space in the city and in this neighborhood.
And Donovan, can you, on that point, I think that was really powerfully said, and that's absolutely true. And, you think that's why the equity aspect of this is so important, right? Like when you think about, whether it's, for example, in a much bigger sense, Flushing Meadows, the treatment Flushing Meadows Corona Park gets versus Central Park or Prospect Park, which have these fancy conservancies and alliances and things like that, and the difference that makes in the quality of resources and services, but also to Traverse Park too, right? Like the amount of work it took from so many to bring it to this point, for where we started out with Traverse Park, was a process as well. And Diversity Plaza was the same thing. Plaza public space, sort of, installed by Bloomberg, but without the resources around it that we had to organize and pressure city government to help us get for our plaza, to take care of it, without it becoming a corporatized or, bid type place, but really a grassroots community space. That requires resources from the city, and that we had to really fight for. And so these issues tie to issues of community and racial justice and equity too. And so I would just say, on that point, Don, I think before we spoke about it, you had just thinking about when we try to shift the perspective around streets and what streets are, who they're for, and what's possible. You had some pretty powerful photos before too of how many people could fit on a street in one perspective versus another, depending on its use. And I don't know if you have it available with you now, but it would be really great to just, see when you rethink who a street is for and how it's designed, what impact that has on the space that's created by that.
Sure, let me dig that up. It'll take me just a second, but I can fill that time by mentioning that, one of the things we have at our disposal right now in terms of the political fulcrum here, the lever we have, is this stimulus money, right, that is coming. And, a few months ago, we thought we were going to be in a dire financial situation. And now my sense, I read the other day, New York City is getting $100 billion of stimulus money. Some significant proportion of that will come to New York City, and it's going to have to be spent in 4 years. And projects like this are perfect for that. Now, to put that in perspective, just to give you a sense, Traverse Park 10 years ago looked almost nothing like it does today. The purchase of Staunton Field, where the tennis courts are, was a $7 million investment by the city. The renovation of Traverse Park, what used to be 78th Street and Staunton Field, was another $7 million. So when you stand in the middle of Traverse Park and look around you, you're looking at $14 million that have been spent in the last less than a decade to make that space what it is today. It was about an acre before, and it hadn't, as you point out, Shaker, it hadn't really been significantly renovated in a very long time, and there was not a blade of grass in the place, right? Not one. There were some weeds popping up here and there, and that was it. So, again, that we had a city council member at the time, Danny Drum, who we still have, who was invested in investing in that that space. But even when you have a city council member who's ready to go, they need community support, they need political cover, they need that argument, and they also need a vision from us, right? And so I think those things are important to remember. So I think I found that image you're talking about, Shaker, while I was chatting there. So let me pull that up real quick. This is there are many examples, similar photos of this you can find on the web. Can you see that image, Shaker?
Yep.
So this is a photo or a series of photos, and like I said, there's a lot of these on the internet. The one on the left was taken in New York City. So in the upper left, you can see what it looks like when 200 people are sitting in 177 cars and how much space that takes up. If you move to the right of that, that's 177 people in the space they take up sitting in lawn chairs, 177 people on bikes in the lower left, and 177 people packed onto 3 buses. Like I said, this is kind of like a meme or a series of memes that's been traveling around the internet for years. But to show people this who don't spend their days, unlike me, right, thinking about this kind of stuff all the time, I think these are really powerful messages. And I will tell you that I am a huge advocate for the kind of changes that I think we need to see on 34th Ave, limiting or eliminating car use. I'll be frank, right? That's my vision. But I am also a driver. I'm a pedestrian. I'm a transit user. I'm a bicyclist. I'm a skateboarder. I don't rollerblade, but I do pretty much everything else. And I still think that at the end of the day, I know that as a driver, this is still the right thing. At the end of the day, this is where we need to be moving. And I also want to say that I would love to hear Rhoda comment on some of this stuff, because I have been talking way too much.
Not at all. Thank you, Donovan. Rhoda, I wanted, and thank you for that explanation, those visuals too. Rhoda, let's shift more to the on-the-ground perspective every day. You're literally on 34th Avenue every day. So we have this framework that Donovan kind of laid out of these citywide, policies and equity issues. What are you hearing on 34th Avenue? And what are your thoughts based on what you're hearing about what is possible with this space to address some of these issues?
I do the barricades, most mornings. I've been doing it since the very beginning. I'm out there at 8 in the morning. I do 79th through 77th. And I think that we just need to make sure that we put as much pressure on our politicians and our elected officials, because I do worry a little bit, not just, I worry about this whole notion that it's supposed to be, the street's going to be permanent. And I think to myself, what does that mean? That can be anything. Permanent for, the summer, permanent for holiday weekends. And I just wonder if they're waiting for us, the volunteers, because it's a volunteer movement, basically. I mean, the volunteers are people, just regular people who get up every morning, put those barricades out at 8 in the morning, and there's another set. Some of the same people do it in the morning, actually do it in the evening. And I just wonder how sustainable that is over time. And I worry about that. But there's organizing that's beginning with a lot of these volunteers, whether it's Friends of 34th Avenue or the 34th Avenue Coalition. And one of the things that's going to happen soon is that they're working on, getting a petition out to sort of get people more involved, to organize around letting our public officials know that this is important to us, and that there's going to be consequences, and that they're not even consequences, there's support. We're going to support our elected officials who support, open streets, the concept of open streets, the concept of more space for non-drivers. And I'm a driver too, just like Donovan. I have a car. I used to have 2 cars in Jackson Heights, believe it or not, and I got rid of one. But again, like Donovan, I do think that we have to do what, things for the greater good. And I truly believe that 34th Avenue is in the best long-term, making 34th Avenue an open street is in the best long-term interest of our community. And we really do need to look for and encourage other ways of getting around in our community, and also getting around outside of our community so that we can be connected. So on the ground, I'm seeing, like I said, it's a diverse experience. There's people from all over the world walking on 34th Avenue. It's like like if some people are not comfortable with the vendors. I love the idea of the street vendors. It makes me feel it feels like an international, like I could be anywhere in the world where that goes on. It's not vending on residential streets is not some wild thing. It's done all over the world. And
especially more during a pandemic.
It's during the pandemic, but even before that, if you travel around the world, this happens. I love how people are, kids are learning how to rollerblade, like you said. Kids are learning how to bike ride. The Fresh Air Fund is coming again. It was here last year. It's a great way for kids to, have activities during the summer. I just think it's such a great, it's like our community, it's a community public space, it's our community meeting ground, it's our, community convention center. There's just so many ways, things that we can be doing with that street. And again, from a safety point of view, some people said like they've been worried that, the streets are going to be dangerous. In fact, some people even said, which is crazy, and maybe we can talk a little bit, I shouldn't even bring this up, but some people were saying that the fire, or the fact that the fire got so bad in the building on 34th and was it 90th, was due to the barricades, and it made it harder for the fire trucks to get to the fire. And that's just not true. And the fire department came out and said that wasn't true. And if you thought about it for 2 seconds, you'd realize that the fact that there were no other cars on the streets made it easier for the fire department to get to the fire.
Exactly. Logically, right? Yeah.
And also, in general, there have been less accidents on 34th Avenue because the streets are calmer. There's just so many positives about the streets being open and more geared towards pedestrian over cars. So I'm super excited about this. And for me, I bike, I rollerblade on it, I will be rollerblading, and I scoot on it with my scooter. There's just so many, it's been a godsend for me. It really has been a godsend. Really helped me through the pandemic as well.
And so many helped, throughout too. I thanks so much for that perspective, Rhoda, too. I know there are questions coming in, so I just wanted to, before we, and I try to combine some of the questions with one that I had for really both of you, and then we'll open it up to all the questions I see coming in, let's just talk for a minute also about street safety, right? We look at Northern Boulevard, that's now called the new Boulevard of Death, right? After Queens Boulevard, now looking at Northern, new Boulevard of Death. How many tragically, children have been hit and killed on Northern Boulevard? On Roosevelt Avenue, I can't imagine it's far behind too, the amount of traffic congestion and the accidents that happen there. What are some ways to make our streets like Northern or like Roosevelt safer? What are ways to really slow down cars and maybe even create more green space in those, especially on Northern as well? I'm kind of curious to hear if either of you have thoughts about that and how that ties into street safety.
I don't know. What about putting another median in the middle of Northern, like we did for 34th Avenue? Donovan, would that be something that we could do? And the other thing is, they were working on protected lanes on Northern closer to Manhattan, but I guess because of the snowstorm, they all got destroyed from the snowplow. Is that what happened? But that was like a protected lane on Northern, which is like, it seems like a real protected lane, not with plastic barricade, little plastic poles. We need something more substantial than that. But, to me, it's pretty easy. Protected bike lane on Northern Boulevard.
I like it. Donovan, you have thoughts?
For a bike lane, the gold standard is to have it protected by a lane of parking and a curb, right? And then so the bikers are really they're basically given their own little road between the sidewalk and the roadway, right? It's this whole separate space for bicyclists. I'm not a transportation planner or a transportation engineer, and interestingly, transportation engineers typically have one focus. They want to move people from point A to point B as quickly as possible. So they don't want friction. They want speed and they want safe. but things like livability and things like that are not necessarily part of their purview, right? Planners, on the other hand, care about those issues, but there's also the consideration of how do you move people around. I think the easiest way to explain it is that people tend to drive slower when the situation is more complicated, right? So if you imagine yourself on a freeway, there's very little that, there's wide open road and 4 lanes, and you just basically point your car in the direction you're going and go, and you can go pretty fast. But if you're on in a neighborhood that has narrow streets and a lot of trees and cars parked there and curbs and bike lanes and other things, you're going to go slower because you don't want to have an accident. And one of the things about Northern Boulevard is it is essentially a highway. It's an at-grade highway. So, talk about the 3 E's of traffic planning. Engineering, right? What's the design of the street? Education, how do we get people to treat it as the type of street it is, as opposed to the type of street they might want it to be? And then enforcement, right? Are you going to write tickets? Are you going to have traffic cameras, speed bumps, whatever? I mean, that's part of engineering as well. But I think there's just so much that needs to be done with Northern Boulevard. The new medians, the expanded medians, the pedestrian refuges have been really important. But part of it is the way that the transportation network in the city is set up, and there are many logical reasons for drivers to use Northern Boulevard to get from point A to point B, to get across the sort of the tip of Northern Queens. And so, maybe we need to think about alternatives for that. Probably one of the things that's most important is getting people out of their cars in the first place.
Yep.
So something like congestion pricing, right, which would be a citywide, regional issue, I think would, if done right, and if done as part of a whole suite of other interventions, because that's another problem, right? We can't just do one thing. All these things fit together like a puzzle. And so we have to, someone's going to have to think carefully. If we institute congestion pricing, what are the effects going to be on Northern Boulevard, positive and negative? And then how do we enhance the positives and mitigate the negatives? Mm-hmm. And so, I think there's a lot of stuff we can do, or we can advocate for around the margins, like a bike lane and like expanded medians and those kinds of things. But then there are also these larger, 30,000 foot view issues that are going to be city government issues, state issues that we also we can't sleep on any of it.
And I think you're right. That's, as Rhoda said, protected bike lanes to busways on Northern as well, or other ways to encourage people to get out of their cars and to think about the space differently. Also, traffic measures, whether it's wider medians to what they call lead pedestrian intervals, where pedestrians can cross the streets before the light changes, or I think they call pedestrian scrambles, where it's like all pedestrians can cross all ways all the time. I'm learning these terminology as I go on too, but I think those are the kinds of things that I think it's so important to rethink some street design, especially on streets like Northern. I do, and I want to get through a few questions. And I know Bill Bruno in a little bit, I want to call on you to talk a bit about a plan that is emerging now when it comes to street safety. But let me get through a few questions first that people had. I'm just going in order. One of the questions that Emily had was, I think one of the amazing things about this idea is that the neighborhood has already prototyped having a carless street. I'd be curious to hear if there have been traffic studies that demonstrate that traffic overall hasn't been negatively impacted. And maybe I'll combine that question with Seth's to say, are there any kinds of traffic studies that show that, or have there been any user studies done on 34th Ave to really respond to some of these criticisms or contrary positions that are taken? And if they're not, maybe that's something we should think about too. Are either of you aware of that?
I know that the DOT told me that they've done traffic counts and studies, and that there has not been a significant increase of traffic on Northern Boulevard or 35th Avenue, or even on the side streets as a result of closing 34th Avenue. I haven't seen the numbers. I haven't seen, this is anecdotal that I've been told by the DOT. I hope that they're going to release that at some point, because I think it's an important thing to
Absolutely.
do. I mean, I've also heard people say, well, there's no way that, even if that's true now, it's because of COVID. And if you did the same study in a year, it would be different. And that may be true, but, again, I don't want to take over the conversation, but I think one thing that's really important to remember is that a significant amount of the traffic on 34th Avenue is people actually using it to avoid Northern Boulevard. And so they're using what should be a residential, not a side street necessarily, but still a residential street. It's inside a neighborhood.
Right.
And they're using it as an alternative to what is essentially a state highway, Northern Boulevard, right? And so when you make it difficult or uncomfortable to do that, it really has a market change on the whole feel of the neighborhood. People go back to Northern Boulevard. And I think that's where that kind of traffic, that kind of through traffic belongs, right? So I'll be very interested to, I hope DOT is going to do some of those studies, or is going to do more of them, or is going to release the ones they've done. But I haven't seen them yet, but supposedly they exist.
Mm-hmm.
And I would also just say traffic, I think, has changed in the neighborhood. And I think that it is complicated because during COVID, a lot of people bought cars. A lot of people stopped taking public transportation. So I think there's some traffic pattern changes just due to that. There is a Jason on the that's participating. It's not the Jason from DOT, is it? I was just wondering if we could talk about the studies, if it is that Jason, but maybe it's not that Jason, but because he would be the perfect person. But yes, that is, I will say, Shaker, as you know, that is a comment that's come up, that people are concerned that, the traffic on other streets has increased due to the closure of 34th Avenue. But like Donovan said, I wonder if that's true and if it's more complicated than just 34th Avenue. I think other things are going on. Like there's been a serious increase in car purchasing. Yes, so across the city.
And one thing before going to the next question for you, Rhoda, is just to also step back for a second to be like, a lot of these, right, when we think about 34th Avenue as an open street, why I think it was important to think about Traverse Park or Diversity Plaza is that these kinds of changes never start out easy, right? The Traverse Park fight, the Diversity Plaza fight was a fight in the beginning, and it was controversial. And you start to put forward different vision and rethink things. It takes time, but I would point to both as great examples of what is possible, where we started and what's possible. And something that, Donovan and I were talking about before this started was that with 34th Avenue, the hardest part has already been done, right? Like to have an open street for 30 blocks, year round like this. The hardest part of re-envisioning 34th Avenue has been done at this point because we've done it and it's been working so successfully. So I just wanted to mention that because I feel like, we've already pushed the thinking significantly. And so we've already kind of opened the door to what's possible. It would be exciting to see what is even more possible from there. But the hardest mental block, I think, has already been accomplished in a way that, undoing it just seems it's not possible at this point. Or it would be so unfavorable to undo it because we've already really changed thinking so much. And so I mentioned that to say sometimes it requires that imagination, and we've already put that imagination into action already. I think that just mentioning with that too, how Danny had mentioned too in Bogota, Colombia, there's a main avenue that's every Sunday morning open for bikers, walkers, runners. And I've seen that in different parts of the world too. In India as well, I've seen it. Like the concept of opening streets or boulevards in this way is nothing new. It's just new for us, and it sadly required a pandemic to do so. But we are so far behind the rest of the world in thinking about streetscapes this way too. Rhoda, a question for you from Rita. Right now, 34th Avenue is 100% volunteer, barricades upkeep, barricades cleanup programs. Based on your experience, when do you think it's reasonable for the city to start covering at least some, if not all of the costs of 34th Avenue open streets? You're out there every day. I know it is no easy operation. The volunteers keep it going. When should the city step in?
The time, I'm plugging in my computer. The time is now. I think that that is one thing I just don't really, that makes me question the city's commitment to this open street is there is really no participation from the city, really. So I think the time is now, and I think we should be trying to encourage the city to get involved. But I do think it has worked out to be a positive thing that it has started off as, you know, from the community. You know, there are a lot of, I mean, it takes a lot, and a lot of the people who do the barricades, I don't live on 34th Avenue, I live on 78th, between 37th and 35th. But a lot of the people who actually do put the barricades up every morning and take them down are people who live on 34th Avenue, you know, because one of the big complaints is that, oh, nobody who lives on 34th Avenue wants open streets. Well, you know, my partners in the barricade deployment in the mornings it's a couple that lives in the Terrace View right on 34th Avenue. I know many people who live in the Dunley Gardens. They love 34th Avenue. My friends Amanda and Jonathan Ettinger, they live in the Towers, also on 34th Avenue. They love the open street. So I would love to see the city get involved, but I am sort of grateful that we as a community had to be initially responsible for all of this, because I think that's kind of the beginnings of the sort of buy-in of trying to make this happen. I mean, if it's going to be, I always say, if it's going to be, it's up to me. If it's going to be, it's up to us. And I think we've got a strong start here with what we've got going on. But I think to sort of have it be sustainable, we're going to need even more involvement from people in the community, and we're going to need help from our elected officials. And frankly, for me, when I think about my tax dollars, these are the kind of activities that I want, this is where I want my tax dollars to be spent. And again, it's going to help everyone, not just the drivers, but it'll help, you know, parents, seniors, the environment. My brother's screaming out to me by, like, you know, having less cars. It's definitely, you know, helping us move to the, you know, a more responsible handling of our environment. So we've got to do this. You know, we really don't have a choice. We really need to be taking back more of the streets for other uses besides cars.
And, you know, I just add to that, but first, a big shout out to Rita, who asked the question too, who actually organizes all the barricade volunteers.
Yes, she does.
On 34th Avenue. We see her there all the time. You know, I think your point is right about the city stepping up and the time being now, because whether it's 34th Avenue or whether it's even Woodside Avenue, where Moo and so many of the Thai community have been the ones who have set up 34th Avenue as the open street that it is to whether it's public spaces like Diversity Plaza that I've worked on for years, or CC Moore Park, it's really incumbent on the city to do far more to give us resources and services, instead of either letting us fend for ourselves and figure out our own, or trying to bring in someone else from the outside to do it. Both of those don't work. And I think what the city needs to really think differently about is supporting the groups on the ground already doing the work around these open spaces, and putting more resources into them, not necessarily into other parts of the city and other public spaces or parks, as opposed to our own. And so I think, you know, it's a resounding yes when the city step up and really support the volunteers doing this work and cover those costs. The time is yesterday in that sense, because, you know, it's for our neighborhoods, whether it's Elmhurst or whether it's Jackson Heights, that's a serious inequality that we need to, inequity that we need to address. So thanks.
And yes. I'd say it's also a particularly sort of a Queens issue, because I do feel, as a Queens resident, sometimes I feel like we're like the wicked, the wicked stepchild, or like the stepchild that they don't really care about. And it goes back to a lot of things, even, you know, Flushing Meadows Park, like you were saying earlier. Sorry? I thought someone was saying something.
Oh, no, I think that's just, I think Jackie, yeah. Go ahead.
But it's like, you know, look, we have all the airports are here. We have the Mets, we have the US Open, but then we look at Flushing Meadows Park, which again, the US Open is held there, like $300 million or whatever is made in that short period of time every year. Our park should look like Fantasy Islands. Yep. I mean, it's a working park. Central Park isn't earning that kind of money. I mean, it's paying its way.
Yeah.
Why can't some of those dollars be left in that park? I would like some more trees in Flushing Meadows Park. I'm sorry. So again, it's like everyone uses Queens. If you're going to fly out of New York City, more than likely you're going to LaGuardia or JFK. If you are going to see the Mets, you're going to Met Stadium, U.S. Open. We are a working borough. We just need to have a little bit more respect. And so it's a bigger issue to me. It's 34th Avenue and it's about Queens and recognizing that much of the population of New York City lives in Queens. And we need to be a priority for New York City, not just Manhattan and not just Brooklyn, Queens.
And not just for those who come from the outside, but for those who actually live here.
That's right. That's right. For the people who live here.
Yeah.
The rest of the people come here and use it. Well, they need to leave a few dollars. Congestion pricing. I don't know. Maybe the congestion pricing needs to be: you come into Queens, you got to pay us. You going to the airport, pay us.
Well said, Rhoda. I mean, that's powerful. The point that you mentioned too, Bill. I wanted to give you a chance. I know you had. There was a plan being floated around, a transportation safe streets plan from Transportation Alternatives, I think, too. So I want to give you a chance to talk about the importance of it and why this is a good idea.
Thanks, Jake. Anyway, I think even if you're not necessarily on board with this plan, by the way, it's a plan that even though it's got Transportation Alternatives name on it, several organizations have backed it, including the 34th Avenue Open Streets Coalition and the Riders Alliance and so on. And I encourage you to read it, even if you're not on board with all of it. It's a great source of ideas and a great source of the holistic thinking. What they advocate is that 25% of car space essentially be reallocated over the course of by 2025. And so, for example, they point out, they want one of the things you could have, for example, is 500 lane miles of new bus only lanes, 500 lane miles of protected class 1, bike lanes, and thousands of miles of permanent open streets and more green spaces and so on. And this matters a lot because this matters a lot because there's so much space that can be used, and really so much of it is overly allocated to cars. I think they had a number in here, for example, where they break that down. Apparently, public space devoted to cars includes 19,000 lane miles for driving, 3 million free on-street parking spaces. That's 1.5 spaces for every car in the city. So I think it places too much for parking. It's got some great ideas. Everyone should be no more than a few minutes away from a green space, no more than a few minutes away from a bus stop, no more than a few minutes away from bike parking, no more than a few minutes away from a bike lane. Sean Donovan was talking about the 15-minute city. Really, we should be aiming at something like the 5-minute city. And I gave the link, and it's worth reading. As I said, even if you're not on board with all of it, it's just a great source of ideas and just a great source of the sort of holistic thinking that we should be looking at.
Well, thanks for mentioning it, Bill. And I think that point about holistic thinking really is the message. I think that as you said, but as Rhoda said before, and Donovan said too, this kind of planning requires a far more comprehensive look at how all these pieces fit together, what we can do to make neighborhoods have more open space and safer streets, and especially from the standpoint of equity, and particularly low-income communities of color and immigrant neighborhoods that often, going back to Robert Moses, have always gotten mistreated on these issues. And it has direct impacts on environmental health when a BQE is run through your neighborhood, or a place for kids to play or to socially isolate during a pandemic. I mean, these things are all tied together. And I think I would just like to say, and kind of, concluding, and I see we're coming up on 9 o'clock now, is just that this ties through with everything, right? How we think about our city requires really from rezonings to land use planning to safe streets and open streets and open space planning, a comprehensive look at what are the existing patterns of inequity or segregation that exist, and how do we address them in a way that really ameliorates and redresses those existing patterns of inequality. And New York City has never been good at doing that, whether it's in the urban planning context or the fair housing context. And I think that this is really a moment to be doing so. And I think, of course, these are issues that are going to be right on the forefront of our city coming out of this pandemic too, from the Open Streets program to public space and public plazas as well. So I want to thank Rhoda and Donovan so much for coming on today too, for the really helpful information. This was such an enjoyable discussion. To everyone who really joined as part of this too. It really goes to show how, you know, we are as neighborhoods at Elmhurst and Jackson Heights are at the forefront of these conversations and pushing the conversation forward on what's possible. And so I'm really proud of everyone who's part of this today too, and in our communities for all that we've done. So thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining tonight too. So good to see you all. And thank you, Millie. I see you on there too. And see you all next week. Thanks everyone.
Woo, bye.
Bye.